my job is a very simple one, really, which is just to introduce and facilitate this discussion. It's a very, very important discussion, and it's a discussion which is going to be focused on investment in African cities, the challenges and the opportunities. And now, given everything that is happening in the world, that discussion is an essential discussion. It's more relevant than ever, considering the challenges currently facing the continent. What we're going to be doing is, in the main, discussing a piece of work which was undertaken by Pinsent Masons and the African Centre for Cities, who are co-hosting this discussion. And the various themes that arose out of that. That discussion will be led by 4 panellists. I'm delighted to say I've got 4 very, very experienced panellists who have a wide array of experience between them, reaching across the continent. Before we do that, though, what's very important is that we set our report and our piece of work in context. And in order to do that, I'm going to hand you over to Liza Cirolia. Liza, I should say, is a senior researcher at the African Centre for Cities based in the University of Cape Town. She was the architect of much of what we see in this important piece of work, and it was a real pleasure to be partnering with Liza and working with her and her colleagues throughout the course of the last year as we put our report and our research together. So with that very, very short background, I'm going to hand over to Liza and ask Liza please to set the context for the work that was undertaken, and of course the discussion that we're subsequently going to have. Thank you, Liza.
Good morning, and thank you so much, Richard, for the introduction. I think it's useful to start by giving a little bit of background on why we're here today, especially because we may have people tuning in who know the African Centre for Cities, but not Pinsent Masons, or who know Pinsent Masons, but not the African Centre for Cities. So the African Centre for Cities, which is based at the University of Cape Town, is a research institution dedicated to looking at, as you might imagine, African cities and cities of the Global South more widely. We explore a whole range of complex issues from food security to urban infrastructure. And we often partner with communities or the state to do something which we call co-producing knowledge. This has been a very unique opportunity for us to actually co-produce knowledge with private sector partners, and Pinsent Mason being a leading law firm on the continent, supporting infrastructure projects at all phases of their development, was an incredibly ideal partner to start this conversation with. The impetus for this session today is to actually draw attention to a report which is being launched this week, as Richard indicated. It's a reflection of what we call the African Cities Thought Leadership Program, which was a 1.5-year program, which was co-designed by Pinsent Masons and the African Centre for Cities, and convened in Johannesburg with clients from Pinsent Mason and African Centre for Cities city experts. The program involved drawing together expertise on African cities from a whole range of perspectives: arts and cultures, decentralized infrastructure, urban governance, with the actual grounded and practical insights of Pinsent Mason's clients who've been on the ground delivering infrastructure projects for quite a long time. Each of the sessions that we had centered around a particular theme, and some of the speakers for those sessions are in fact on the panel today. And I think some are also, I could see in the audience, so thank you for joining us. The point of departure for this entire program was that African cities are urbanizing. Many are urbanizing rapidly, and they require significant infrastructure investments to address the mounting backlogs and the existing shortfalls, as well as the future demands that will be coming online as cities grow. This was the shared position of understanding that I think most people who arrived at the events agreed on. Where things get a little bit more complex is when we start to ask questions about what types of infrastructure are needed and the sorts of governance arrangements which are necessary to support this. For us, a good place to start is to try to understand the current models for infrastructure delivery and the assumptions which underpin these, both about the way that cities currently operate and how they might operate into the future. This, of course, as you can imagine, required the sort of provocative approach of academic expertise mixed with real hard experience from practitioners on how these models operate. What we found was that many of the private sector participants recognize that the current models of delivery are not ideal. They've been perhaps successful in delivering major highways, mini malls, many big energy plants, but they've not necessarily been able to meet the demands, needs, and desires of the majority of people living in African cities. They've been geared in many ways to pigeonhole African cities into economic functionality in service of wider supply chains rather than support their social, political, and everyday aspirations. They've also often not been attentive to resource constraints and sustainability imperatives, which will become increasingly important as we move forward. One thing which is particularly important is they've often relied on striking deals with national technocrats and ignoring local governments, many of whom actually have the mandate to deliver on these functions. So we agreed that the current model, as well as the skills, risk calculations, partnerships which have underpinned it, need to be revised. But what we often struggled with was thinking about asking the hard questions of what this revision would look like, who would need to drive it, and what role the private sector could play in contributing to this transformation. So we're here today to think together, essentially, and hopefully in the future, in fact, act together on what these sort of future experimentations and innovations might look like. I'm going to hand it back now to Richard to introduce the panelists, who all I think have really interesting and provocative takes on this question. And hopefully we can then open it up to people who are listening and hear some other ideas about what we could be doing moving forward. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you very much, Liza. That sets the context perfectly. And I was particularly struck by what you were saying there about the need for partnerships, the need for collaboration, and the private sector recognising that the current models don't work, but perhaps not being entirely clear about what needs to change. I think that's a theme that we're going to be picking up a lot during the course of the discussion. In terms of the panellists, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to go to each panellist and ask each panellist to just set out their sort of key takeaways, the things that they would like really the audience to have in mind as we frame our discussion. And we'll do that with each of our four panelists in turn. I'm going to start with Wangari Muikia. Wangari is a leading economist in Africa. She works extensively across the continent. She's based in Nairobi. She has a particular interest in one of the key points which Liza was touching upon, which is around the whole need to engage with national and local government, improve their fiscal efficiencies and effectiveness. And perhaps, Wangari, you could just start off in the context of the panel session, and just perhaps building on some of the things that Liza has touched on, and your own experience and your own views, set out the key things that you would like our panel and our audience to have in mind.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you, everyone. It's good to see you, and I'm glad to be here with you. So today I want to discuss measuring risk in Africa and what that might look like from a PPP angle. But let me start with a few demographics and opportunities. It's no secret that a lot of investment is needed, especially in African cities. But it's also clear to me that the opportunity lies here. 15 of the fastest growing cities in Africa, in the world, are in Africa, in Tanzania, Congo, Uganda, Nigeria, and Ethiopia. And couple this with the fact that 75% of Africa's total population is under 35, and they want to move to cities. Can these cities house them, provide transport for them, provide jobs, food, healthcare, education? Is Wi-Fi available? Can these African cities invest in resources fast enough? Time has shown that they are constrained, and about currently 600 million Africans lack access to the electricity grid. And this will grow and continue to hinder progress if not addressed. From a gender perspective, cities provide more opportunities for women. In Uganda, for example, 70% of single-person informal businesses are owned by women, even though men own the larger businesses. And for this fact, there's need for secure places for women and children to ensure that they are preyed upon. Income's also rising in the space, which brings a lot of opportunities for consumer market and for investors at large. We also can't ignore the effects of COVID-19 and what that will mean for infrastructure development going forward. One of my concerns has been whether there will be a growing gap between Africa and the West, because the fundamental changes that the West or developed countries are making to their infrastructure as a result of being harder hit by the COVID-19 might not translate in Africa, because most African countries were not as hard hit. And will this mean that we go back to business as normal? And will this increase the divide between the opportunities for infrastructure? Or does this present an opportunity for Africa to kind of go in its own direction and to develop its own kind of unique status infrastructure assets? Or can we leapfrog? Since we don't have elaborate infrastructure in place, can we just cherry pick the most latest and innovative solutions and implement them faster to the full capacity, unconstrained by older infrastructure? This looks to me like an opportunity for investors. Some emerging examples have been the need for ICU units, more beds in hospitals, Wi-Fi access in rural areas, mobile tools for education delivery. So it's evident that African cities need infrastructure to support their growth, both large like mass transit systems, a solid waste system, infrastructure, urban water, but also smaller infrastructure such as additional classrooms in schools and more wards for healthcare service delivery. Now, there are many reasons why African cities in general have not been able to invest in assets, in these assets, and an important one being the inefficient use of public finance management systems. But it's clear that one solution for African cities is engaging in PPPs. So why aren't there more PPPs? One of the main reasons is because potential investors feel like Africa is this, there's too much risk and Africa is this big black box. But is that really the case? The workshop duly noted that this might be a pervasive myth. And I like to look at this from three key PPP perspectives. The first one is creditworthiness. In cities, we see high inefficiencies in revenue collection, high costs, and problematic working capital management, which constrains private sector investment. However, there are now new initiatives to measure creditworthiness in African cities. In Kenya, for example, in the subnational counties, they developed credit ratings for, credit ratings were developed by the Global Credit Rating Agency, and this is very useful to inform subnational PPPs. The second point is capacity for PPPs. Many countries lack the capacity to design, to implement, and to oversee long-term complex contractual arrangements such as multi-year PPPs. But the establishment of PPP units and enhancements through the support of entities such as the Public-Private Infrastructure Advisory Facility have started to provide a framework for this capacity and its growth. Although this doesn't necessarily translate it into efficiencies in the short term, this is a very good reference point and a tool at hand from which from where we can start. And the third one is political economy. And this has always been a major distortionary variable. Managing this means having credible local partners to undertake practical political analysis with the investor. At some point, we discussed creating a PPP investment advisory index for potential investors in Africa. And I think this is a conversation that's ongoing with Pinsent Masons going forward. An example in Eswatini, where I worked, my firm worked on developing the intergovernmental fiscal transfer framework, and there was a lot of political economy at play. A new city called Sikupe was created around an area surrounding the King Mswati III International Airport to increase business activity and to maximize the use of the airport. And Sikupe is essentially a city within the 5-kilometer radius of the airport, and incentives for investment and growth were created in that area. However, there were a lot of complexities in creating Sikupe. While the Minister for Housing and Housing and Urban Development is allowed within the parameters of the Urban Government Act to declare any area an urban area, a negotiated solution had to be arrived at to include the chiefs whom the land was taken from. And if anybody knows anything about Eswatini, the land politics are very complex because it is a kingdom, and the land is owned by the kingdom and executed through the chiefs. So it was not an easy task, and the final solution for an in-kind and financial compensation to the chiefs had to be arrived at. And once the land was secured and declared urban, then it has to be subdivided and registered with title deeds for onward sale. So the mix between cultural and modern investment lies in understanding the cultural, political, and socioeconomic context. And this information is well understood by the locals. So this example shows that it's important to do your due diligence to have key partners on the ground. And this can also translate into knowledge transfer to local firms to address the previous issue of capacity constraints. So in closing, I will say that there is a real opportunity for learning from ongoing PPPs, what has worked and what hasn't worked. Not all PPPs have to be large. As earlier indicated, one can manage risk by starting small and learning and then growing. Thank you. Back to you, Richard.
Thank you, Wangari. Thank you very much indeed. That's a wonderful sales pitch for Africa, and it's lovely to hear someone talking so passionately about the opportunities as well as the challenges on the continent. And I hope that's something which resonates with not just our panelists, but the audience at large. And your final point I thought is particularly interesting. It is coming back to this point around the need for partnerships and the need for collaboration, and the need for local partners, and how that can not just benefit the immediate project, but actually helping skills transfer into the continent as well. It's a really, really powerful point. Moving on from this theme, though, that Africa needs a different model, a different approach. I'm now going to move the discussion on to our next panelist, who is Lauren Hermanus. And Lauren is a sustainable development researcher and practitioner. She works with colleagues at the University of Cape Town and the African Centre for Studies, but she also is the founder of a business called Adapt, which is a particularly interesting and relevant organisation for this discussion, because it does look to seek to challenge some of the more template-driven, rigid models which are historically imposed, perhaps on the continent, and then found not to work. Lauren, if I can please ask you just to give your initial thoughts and shape our conversation, that'd be most helpful. Thank you. I think you're still on.
Thank you for that introduction. Yes, quickly recovered. Thank you for that introduction, Richard, and also thank you, Liza and Wangari, because you both mentioned, picked up some of the themes that I'd like to emphasize as well. So there are two main points that I'd like to make this morning. And one is around, how we think about our long-term planning and the outcomes that we're striving for in urban development on the continent. And one is about how we get there. So the first point, and reflecting on this kind of COVID, post-COVID, in the COVID moment, is a question around how do we interact with crisis in our planning processes. And it's fair to say that many of our long-term planning processes have been suspended or derailed, in order to attend to the way that in order to attend to the COVID crisis. And I think it's really imperative for those of us working across different development areas that we really not lose our commitment to our long-term programs of work. And I think, as Wangari said, African cities need infrastructure, a whole host of different infrastructure interventions. And one does kind of, I think that some legitimate concern around the way that funding has shifted, certainly in the research space, which I think is really critical as we move forward, to new infrastructure configurations, as Liza mentioned, shifting away from highly centralized models to perhaps more decentralized models. That this shifts in resources away from some of the questions that we've been thinking about in those areas is concerning, and I hope temporary, because there are many questions that I think need to be answered, and they need to be answered, I think, especially in light of COVID and the economic consequences of COVID. So now to my second point, which is really to say that although we have these long-term goals, for example, still as laid out, for example, in the Sustainable Development Goals, we obviously have to rethink what kinds of actions are feasible for us to achieve those goals over the short and medium term. So the first question that I've been thinking about is about decentralization. So we've been thinking a lot more about decentralized infrastructure development, challenging, for example, the dominance of centralized and often quite problematic state-owned enterprises, national state-owned enterprises in infrastructure development. So picking up on Liza's comments, there's been a lot of reflection on the ways in which those infrastructure delivery models do not work, do not serve us. And also picking up on what Wangari said, they have their own political economy, and some of the thinking around decentralized infrastructure development has been around also interrupting quite sturgid and perhaps not so functional political economies around infrastructure delivery. But if we think about, how is so there've been lots of promises made about loans to developing countries to assist with post-COVID recovery. If those loans happen to land at the national level, which most of them, I'm assuming, will do. What does that mean for more decentralized infrastructure development at the subnational level, and how will this these new financial flows to national governments reinforce existing political economies that perhaps make it quite difficult to move funds down to the subnational level? So that's one thing. The second aspect is around distributed infrastructure. So a lot of innovation to meet the needs of underserved urban populations has been focused on pay-for-use options. And I'm thinking specifically here around in the energy sector, looking at off-grid or non-networked infrastructure options. A lot of those solutions have depended on the idea that these solutions are affordable, even for low-income households, and that there's a willingness to pay. So at this moment, I think given how COVID has perhaps shifted increased vulnerability in the countries that we're looking at, how do we need to adjust our ideas about affordability to pay and people's willingness to pay? And I know of a few projects, which were looking at providing energy to households, so solar home systems to households, or perhaps also providing, solar-powered refrigeration to small and medium enterprises. There's still a need for those services, but is there a demand? So is there a demand for a service that needs to be paid for? Are people still prioritizing that? And I think we don't know, because that's still so new. It's the landscape sort of shifting under our feet. And I think that's an area that really requires investigation. And then to my third and final area of reflection is picking up on Wangari's presentation again, considering specifically the role of PPPs and the private sector more broadly. And, I think it's not just about we want public-private partnerships, but what kind of public-private partnerships do we want? Now, historically, a lot of public-private partnerships have played into some rather challenging political economy patterns. So, the hope, I think, has been, and certainly within conversations around decentralization, how do we shift those? How do we have public-private partnerships that are more beneficial, that are oriented around developmental outcomes, that consider risk and risk mitigation and the benefit of risk mitigation, not just in financial terms, but also in broader socio-political terms, socio-economic terms as well. One of the things that I was sort of reflecting on, and I think that this is probably something that's occurred to a lot of people, is how are the private actors in those public-private partnerships embedded in global supply chains, and how have those global supply chains contributed to a lack of resilience in African cities and countries, and how could they possibly shift? And I think that's questions around, to what extent through PPPs are we actually developing local manufacturing capacity, localizing supply chains? Well, we know, for example, in energy where I work, that the answer to that question is, well, very little has happened in terms of localization. And so actually, when you have interruptions to global supply chains, and specifically I'm thinking here of components for renewable energy coming into the continent, from China specifically, when you have those interruptions, you're left with very little option of how to move forward. And so I think, it's just, I guess, it's not making a case for localization. I think there have been lots of cases made for localization, but it's perhaps adding to that case, or restating the case for localization. And so, yeah, so basically my contribution is just to say that, one has to keep one's eye on the goal of infrastructure development, urban infrastructure development. That's still very necessary on the continent. However, we have to think about how questions around decentralization, distributed infrastructure options, and the role of the private sector shift now during this time of crisis over the short term, but also perhaps giving us a little bit of space to rethink over the medium and long term how we want those different patterns of organization to play out as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ron. You put that very, very well, very, very powerfully. Yeah, I can see that there are certain things in the context of COVID-19 and the pandemic which might affect the short term, but the long term fundamentals perhaps remain. And there's a couple of other points that you make there, just to get the thinking going across our attendees, and the questions are coming through thick and fast, which is great to see. And it's this point around risk, and is that risk, real or imagined risk? And your point about PPPs and PPPs perhaps being judged and analysed and looked at in terms of their socio-development contribution as well as their financial contribution. That, of course, is an issue which does not just affect Africa. That affects PPPs wherever they are in the world. And it's not a point, again, an issue for Africa. It's an issue for PPPs, I would suggest. Your other point about the debate around localization in China, and this isn't all about African localization. Yes, I think a great point, a really, really powerful point, because there may be a view that actually more diversity and more alternatives across the globe from reliance on a supply chain from one nation, one great nation like China, might be a good thing. So there may be all sorts of different reasons. It's not just about African localization, it's actually about a global benefit. I'm hoping that we've got Julia on. She's been struggling to get on. Julia, are you on? If we haven't got Julia on, then I'm going to go to you, Anton. And I can't hear anything from Julia, so I'm going to assume that she can't get on. I'll be notified, I'm sure, in our chat box if she's been able to make it on. But in the meantime, Anton, can I just go to you then and introduce you, please, Anton Cartwright, an economist with the African Centre of Cities, University of Cape Town, a glittering CV, which would take me far too long to take attendees through and do justice to. I'm just going to mention one piece of work which you have been involved with, Anton, and that's your work with the Coalition for Urban Transition, in looking in particular at Ghana and Tanzania. It seems that some of that work, that component of your work, is particularly relevant to this discussion. And in the context of that and your wider experience, I'd be very, very interested to ask you, please, to share your views with the panel and with our attendees. Thank you, Anton.
So thank you, Richard, and thank you, Pinsent Mason, and to my colleagues at the African Centre for Cities for what I think is, and it's important to say this is a report for this time, right? This is a crucially and timeless piece of work. For the reasons that have already been discussed, which is Africa is urbanizing fast, late. It's the last continental region to go through its urbanization phase at relatively low levels of per capita income. But the process is very much underway. And how the 20 to 30 million people that are being added to Africa's urban spaces every year and will continue to be added for the next 2 to 3 decades, how those people access services and economic opportunities and are assimilated into the fabric of urban spaces will determine the fate of the countries which they're in. And dare I say, now that we have a heightened appreciation for the interconnectedness of our global system, will determine the fate of many, many global outcomes, whether it be climate change, migration, conflicts, and energy. So this is a crucial piece of work. But it's equally important that we get beyond what I often hear and sort of define as the fund manager or the investor's lament, or maybe even their anthem sometimes, which is, oh, Africa must make itself bankable and then the money will flow. Let me suggest that that's an intellectually lazy position to adopt from the investor's perspective. And in some instances, it confuses their own lack of familiarity with the African urban context with risk. And that's an unfortunate and inappropriate conflation of issues. And we've heard already many of the reasons why the particular landscape in Africa needs to be made more legible and better understood if investment is going to flow to the right geographical corners and to the right technological options and to the right socio-technical systems to really give African cities the lift that they not only are capable of off the back of the urbanization phase, but which also would lift the region and the global economy out of its particular current predicament. And I want to add, or just reiterate one point that's already been made, so which is this crucial relationship that's often underappreciated between central or national governments and local governments. So in many ways, the last decade has been a decade of cities, and we've seen amazing international networks emerge, linking cities and urban opportunities, and that for me has been a very positive trend. But no city, whether it's Addis Ababa or Accra, is an island, and all cities, may I suggest, are better off if they are able to draw on enabling and supportive national governments. And in this instance, in particular, fiscally and financially enabling national governments. And Africa has appreciated this for some time, right? As far back as June 2014, the African Union ratified the Charter on Values and Principles of Decentralization, Local Governance, and Local Development. I had to read it, it's a long title. Back in 2014. Understanding that fiscal devolution and the decentralization of decision-making is really the lifeblood of urban development. And yet, 6 years later, only 6 of the 54 countries in Africa have actually ratified for themselves that AU Charter, which suggests that there's something else going on here, right? And what has already been alluded to, which is this political tension between national governments and local governments, and the fact that in most instances, actually, what some people on this call might understand as an urban government or an urban authority actually doesn't exist in many African cities, right? There isn't a democratically elected, fiscally powerful and fiscally autonomous local authority with a balance sheet, able to marshal finance, able to get the spatial specificity and the technological nuance of investment in infrastructure right at the city scale. So that doesn't exist. And sometimes it doesn't exist for very good reasons, because national governments understand that it is indeed cities where the political opposition is incubating, and they're incredibly wary of handing over fiscal power to those urban authorities. So it's not a rational standoff. There are very real political reasons behind this. But what do you do about that? And I think it comes back to this point which has already been made. You need partnerships which span both the tiers of government, but also bring in lateral partners, including some of the partners which are already active. And I think one of the great clues that investors need to interrogate with much more attention is how people are accessing services actually sometimes in the absence of the state. So how are people constructing access to water and energy and mobility and waste management when the state has left quite significant spatial vacuums in many of these cities? And there are clues in understanding that which I think can lead to much more effective and much more productive investment. And that's both productive for the investor, because the return on investment will remain a requirement. We understand that, but also productive for the system into which they're investing. And a final anecdote to kind of illustrate this point and what is possible is investors need to appreciate just how much money is available at the city scale for investment in infrastructure. Through the Coalition for Urban Transitions and our partners in Tanzania, we did a study that calculated that if everything worked out perfectly, so fiscal transfers, willingness to pay, donor money, in Dar es Salaam, the capital of, not the capital of the biggest city in Tanzania, you have at most $23 per person per year to invest in infrastructure and in fact in urban services. That should be quite a sobering figure for many people, because actually the number is probably much closer to 10, and the timing of that money is also very uncertain. So it's very difficult to invest coherently around that number. And so how do we design an investment and package and an infrastructure and services package backwards from the needs of urban people with that number in mind? And that's the challenge that I'll leave with you, and maybe we can pick up later. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Anton. I think that's a very, very good moment to go into our discussion. And your summation there, I think, captures a lot of the themes that have come through our panelists. This point about the rigid models, the traditional models don't work, I think is illustrated by your advice to investors around the need to understand how things currently work. And if you understand how things currently work, then that will inform your thinking about what might work better in the future. In terms of questions, we have a number have come through on the chat box, and I'm going to pick up a couple of those. We've got about half an hour for questions, perhaps a little bit less than that. But also, if you raise your hand, then Alma, who is making everything work in the background, will identify you. And if you want to ask your question orally and let us hear your wonderful voice, we'd be delighted to hear that as well. So there's two ways you can ask your questions. So just while people are getting their thinking hats going, I'm going to start with a couple of the questions that have come through on the chat. And the first one, I think, Lauren, goes to something that you said, because you touched on sustainable development goals, and you made a point around the need for those to be sort of considered sensitively and carefully. I imagine in the context of African cities, what is an attainable sustainable development goal in Europe? There may be very, very different things that need to be thought about in the context of Africa. And that goes to a question which has come through, which is around urban planning and around smart cities and the design of smart cities, all of which very, very, very topical in many parts of the world, in Asia and in Europe, very, very relevant to the achievement of sustainable development goals. We do hear, of course, in the context of Africa, some interesting and exciting stories around sustainability, around the green agenda, around smart city development. I'm thinking of Kigali, for example. What is your sense of the view that should be taken of the achievement of sustainable development goals in the context of planning in Africa? And can it be a one-size-fits-all, or does one just need to recognize that it is going to have to be flexed depending upon where we're looking in the continent?
Yeah, so I could just kind of answer that quite quickly and say no. no, the answer is no. We can't have one size fits all. But I think also, you know, the question almost presupposes that, you know, there are a whole bunch of people who are thinking about social development, and then there are people who are thinking about green and sustainable issues, and, you know, never the twain shall meet, and it's kind of a fight, and there's all these trade-offs that need to happen. And I think that, you know, this is not the case. I think people who are developing urban infrastructure aren't deliberately doing that in a way that is destructive to ecological infrastructure, for example. I think there's a growing recognition that you know, the conservation of ecological infrastructure is absolutely imperative, and that we're getting better and better at also valuing that in financial terms as well. And so I do think so there's the question of sort of you know, trade-off between social development and the conservation issues, for want of a better word, and I think that those trade-offs are being reframed all the time. To the question of sort of smart cities, which obviously has to do with you know, resource efficiency as well. But I think to the question of smart cities, and, you know, this really comes back to also this ideas about distributed infrastructure, and which speaks to, you know, alternative financing mechanisms, alternative governance mechanisms. Yeah, I think we do need to recognize that a smart city, firstly, it's not an end state. Nobody knows what a perfect smart city will look like. It's a postulate. It's an intellectual thought experiment, and the process of developing from where we are towards more distributed, interconnected, and sort of automated urban infrastructure, I think is a process that needs to be grounded in what currently exists. So, you know, when we kind of imagine a smart city, you know, starting, for example, with, you know, where like Berlin, and then if you imagine like what a kind of some smart city interventions might look like, you know, even for a city like Cape Town, South Africa, you're just thinking about different kinds of interventions over the short and medium term. And so I think that the idea of a smart city can be sometimes a little bit destructive, in that there's a sense that one has to kind of overhaul everything all at once and replace everything that's there. And I think that it's very important not only to pay attention to the local context, but also to understand that one can also approach the idea of a smart city in a way that is incremental, that develops over time, and that responds both to the availability of resources, the availability of finance, and also to what is actually needed in that city as well. But yeah, leave it there.
Okay, and that of course ties in exactly with what Anton was talking about, which is the need to actually understand what is there and what people actually need, rather than just present them with what it actually is that one has, and which one wants to give them. Moving on to the next question, which I think really is one for you, Wangari, and that very enthusiastic and passionate explanation that you gave of the exciting opportunities that there are in Africa, and it goes to the point, I think, about things being imagined rather than real. But perception is important, so we need to address perception. And the question really is around the perception that corruption is rife in Africa. And the question has come through, a very sensible, balanced question, which is, the presentation was excellent. The opportunities clearly exist, but you didn't mention corruption. Is that something that I, as an investor, should be concerned with, or is my perception actually wrong? And and the corruption is everywhere in the world. It needs to be addressed and managed, and it's no worse in Africa than anywhere else. So just your sense of where you would see corruption in Africa, and how, if you're able to do so, that might compare with what one might find in the context of other investment opportunities elsewhere in the world.
Thank you, Richard. I think that's a very interesting question, and oftentimes, I think corruption has been used as this kind of big obstacle to investment. Everybody, the minute someone says corruption, then it's kind of this big roadblock. But I would put to you that you would have to really break it down and to make sure that you understand what we're really talking about, because corruption, as we know, as you rightly said, Richard, it's not just in Africa. There are different contexts in different continents where corruption is experienced. But it's become this big question mark for Africa. How do you deal with corruption? There are different types of corruption. You can find, there's supply side, there's demand side, and so you can't really just say, corruption exists because the government agencies or the people who are investing in, who need the investments, are the ones who are rent seeking. But in most of the different points that I mentioned, and I only mentioned 3, and definitely there's a whole slew, and I didn't pointedly talk about corruption, but indirectly, political economy is very much to do, is where most of these issues, a lot of these issues can be addressed. And I think if you understand the political economy, if you understand, the socio-economic context, if you understand how things operate, and also if you understand, get experience from what other PPPs have been engaged in. The PPPs have been ongoing on the continent for a long time, and there needs to be some sort of comprehensive way of collecting all these different experiences and understanding exactly how these things play out. In many contexts, some people don't really see some of the rent-seeking behavior as corruption. Some of them say, this is how culturally it's done. But then, trying to understand, and I'm not saying that it's right, I'm just saying that there are different perceptions, and it's what I would say is that we really need to break it down. And we talked about earlier, right, Richard, this concept of an index, and saying, what does it look like? What are the different parameters we should look like? What does political economy look like? Who are the players? What is the risk associated with those players based on their historical, management and leadership? What is the risk when it comes to the legal framework? Land rights policy. How is that being dealt with? What is the risk when it comes to capacity? And therein, once you start to unpack those different boxes, and once you start to understand how those different, different areas or different aspects work, then you can begin to actually bite your teeth and engage in a positive way forward. I think just saying corruption sometimes it can be lazy, it can be a big roadblock, and I think it doesn't help to push the conversation forward. It's better to really think about what the different aspects are and unpack them, and then move forward using that perspective.
Thank you very much. I think it also goes to choosing your local partner carefully, as somebody who understands the local market, somebody who you can trust. I think it goes to exactly that. I think it doesn't, as you say, detract from the great investment opportunities that exist. It just means that one needs to be careful, as one needs to be careful in many other countries in the world. I would encourage people, please, to stick your hands up. If you have a question that you would like to ask orally, we have the facility to do that. And Alma in the background is looking at her screens to see if we've got any hands up. So please do that. We've still got 15-20 minutes left, so we've got plenty of time for you to be asking your questions. And while you're thinking of those and being brave enough to put up your hands, I'm going to turn to you now, Anton, if I may, and it's a question really around procurement models, and I sense, I know what your response to this is going to be, but the question, I think the question is specifically around the DRC, which is a very specific geography, of course, with its own particular unique set of challenges. But the question perhaps goes a bit wider than that. and it's really around the best procurement model to attract foreign investment into infrastructure. So if you're looking at a major infrastructure project, do you have a sense, given the work that you've had, of the type of procurement model which, over the course of your experience, you've seen work best in terms of attracting foreign investment into economic infrastructure? So we're talking about big roads, rail, big infrastructure, major infrastructure, mega projects. Do you have a sense of what you sort of think has what you've seen work well? Perhaps is a way of framing the question.
Thanks, Richard. I just note that there actually are some hands, so I don't know. I'm very happy to answer the question, but
okay.
Should we try and do both, or
let's try and do both? Okay. Let's try and do both. We've got loads and loads of questions coming through now. If you could answer that question very quickly, then Anton, then perhaps I can ask Alma to unmute the first person who has a question that they would wish asked. But
right.
Okay.
So you ask the most wicked of questions and ask for the shortest of answers. I get it.
I'm allowed to do that.
Okay. So, I mean, where this plays out, and let me answer it this way, where this plays out is in industrial strategy, right? And I think there's a real danger that that African countries are being coerced into, and sometimes by opportunistic investors, into an industrial strategy which would see them replicating sort of Europe 200 years ago. And that would be a complete dead end, all right? And it's cynical and it's opportunistic, and it needs to be avoided, because there are many actors within African countries who, through patronage networks or just through vested interest, stand to benefit from that model, but it would be a disaster. And so somehow we need to create the conversation in procurement, to go to the question. And I've never worked in the DRC, so I'm not an authority on that. But in procurement, we need to bring together climate strategy, and most African countries now have a climate strategy and a nationally determined contribution. Industrial strategy, which remains the flagship strategy in many of these countries, and indeed urban strategy or policy or national urban policy. And that needs to be one conversation in the procurement programs, right? So that we don't go down some carbon or some other dead end, which might make an investor a quick buck in the short term, but would hemorrhage long-term opportunities and would lose money over the long term, and would not do justice to the opportunity of urbanization on the African continent. So in that, I think you've already mentioned partnerships. You said you need to find the right partners. I would go further and say you need to find the right ecosystem. You need to build an ecosystem which includes legal, civil society, informal sector, traditional authority partners that you can draw on. And the goal has to be to de-risk these investments. Now, that's a cliche, so what do we mean? De-risk in a systemic sense, not in the currency risk or the project management risk. Yes, we know how to do that. There are models that can do that very easily, but de-risk the systemic urban system through the way in which you invest. And who can hold that systemic and interdisciplinary conversation? That's the ecosystem that investors need to build if they're going to invest successfully over the long term in African infrastructure. And that's a procurement challenge.
Thank you very much indeed, Anton. This theme we're hearing right through is Africa becomes a lot less complicated if one talks about it and one engages with the continent and with the people who know, and the people who know who are the people who are there. So it's this point around collaboration, around partnerships, around the correct ecosystem, as you say, which is the theme I'm hearing across all of our panelists, and perhaps it's what has been missing in a lot of the conversations which have been taking place to date around Africa. We do have some hands up. So Alma, can you please unmute our first participant who would like to ask their question? If I could ask you please to give your name and then ask your question. If you would like to direct that at a panelist, then please do. So thank you, Alma.
Sylvia, please go ahead and ask your question.
And we have Sylvia. Thank you, Sylvia.
Hi, this is Sylvia Crusoe speaking, research associate with the African Center for Cities and currently with WITS. I have to go into another call at 11, and I had my hand up when Wangari was speaking, so her question is actually for her. I was just wondering, but thank you to all the speakers, really interesting and really timely, this webinar. A lot of interesting points and issues that were raised by everyone. But I was just wondering specifically I don't know if I got it right, when Wangari was speaking, she mentioned a PPP advisory index or facility. Is that something that is being proposed, or does that actually exist? So that was just a very concrete question that I had.
Thanks for your question, Sylvia. There's not, when we did we were having initial conversations with Pinsent Masons, and one of the conversations that we had was, developing an index that measures the risk or the readiness of different countries to enter into PPPs. And this would be some sort of compound index. Now, when we looked around to find out whether this already exists, we found that it exists for different jurisdictions, but there's not one specifically an African-focused one. And so we thought that there may be an opportunity to develop something like that for Africa. That's something that measures, high risk, low risk, high opportunity, low opportunity going forward. Now, the other ones that do exist, there were some challenges that they're not developed regularly. They are developed maybe, in 5-year intervals, which sometimes is not very useful. It doesn't really include some political economy considerations. So there definitely is space for creating a new index that would then be informed by, political economy, legal, legal parameters, capacity, et cetera, that could provide some concrete information or concrete guidance for investors who want to invest in different PPPs across the continent.
Thank you very much. And do we have another question, please?
We don't have any further raised hands, so we can return to chat questions.
Okay. Well, I have got. There's some more questions coming through. They're coming through thick and fast on the chat box. I think we'll ask this one and then see how we're doing for time, because we're drawing to the end of our hour now. But we've got a very searching question here, which is a sort of a hard investor question, if I can put it that way, and that is in allocating resources. Should the focus be on those which have historically outperformed others? i.e., should the focus be on the strongest, best performing cities and regions, in the hope that they will bring up the performance and well-being of the less performing cities and regions? So a very, very good question. I think quite a tough one, quite a potentially emotive one. And which of you would like? I would imagine that each of you would have a view on that. Maybe what we do is just a couple of sentences, please, from each of you, from Lauren, from Anton, and from Wangari. Then I think we're going to have to close because we're reaching the end of our time. I'm going to go back to Liza just to pull things together. But just a couple of sentences, please, from each of you on that question. Should we be focusing on the stronger performers who will thereby bring up the weaker performers? And I'm going to start, if I may, with you, Anton.
So look, it's the investor's prerogative to screen. And I think to a certain extent, sending a message that governance does count, let's not get away from that, and that countries that are able to muster a balance sheet and make legible their governance procedures, I wouldn't ever want to discourage that. And I think it's a useful incentive to hang out there. But what I would want to discourage is something that's already been referred to by my fellow panelists, which is the cherry picking of the easy, because they're familiar, investment opportunities. And this has led to the absolute proliferation of shopping malls, gated communities, commercial office spaces. And that comes at the expense of the much more difficult but much more important investments in sanitation, solid waste management, and water supply. So you cannot get away with cherry picking and nurture your ecosystem at the same time. Right? That's a very short-term, and I suggest cynical investment strategy, and it's not going to unlock the opportunity that it's hand here. So by all means, screen for risks across countries and communicate your thinking on that. But we've got to get beyond the cherry picking of the islands of bankability within the broader urban system, because it's the urban system that requires the resources and the investment.
Okay, thank you very much, Anton. Lauren, please, a couple of sentences from you. Bearing in mind we are now over time, but I just think this is such a big question. If you could just give us a couple of thoughts, leave us with a couple of thoughts. And you're on mute again, Lauren, I think.
I'm going to respond to the question from the perspective of governments and from development practitioners, development agencies, rather than from the side of the investor. And that's to say that I think, so a few years ago, Western Cape government actually took, in South Africa, which is provincial government, actually took this view of the development of towns and cities in terms of prioritizing its own investments. And I think there were a lot of assumptions about if you build it, they will come. So if you invest in well-functioning urban systems, then everybody is going to pick up and move to those urban systems. That doesn't happen. What you have is the creation of incredible vulnerability, often where invulnerability already exists. And so from a developmental perspective, I think it is really about, okay, so to concur with Anton, but what is the role of governments and development agencies in improving the conditions in de-risking, as Anton said, systemically, however, not just from a narrow financial perspective, opportunities for investment where vulnerability also exists and where there is an urgent developmental imperative.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that is probably a subject for another webinar, but really great answer. Wangari, just a couple of sentences from you, a couple of final thoughts from you on that question, and then please back to Liza to bring everything to a close.
Great, I'll try to be very brief. So I think definitely there are advantages. There are definite advantages going into some of these tried and true environments, because you then benefit from what everybody else has tried, and you're working in an environment that's been largely tested. But then, of course, there's high competition. A lot of people want to enter that space, so then you have to be fighting for to invest in different. To invest in different PPPs that might have a lot of competition in investment from others. So I think there's also that. But in the 15 cities I talked about that are fastest growing in Africa, some of them actually are quite small cities. But in the next 10 to 15 years are going to have doubling population. Their population is actually going to double. So there's a lot of return. It's high risk, but it's also very high return. And so I think it also depends on the risk appetite of the investor. But I think at the final stage, even we go back to the index. If you have some sort of index that shows, where the countries fall in terms of high risk, high return, low risk, low return, then depending on the risk appetite of the different investors, then they can decide which areas that they want to go into.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Wangari. And Liza, please, some closing thoughts from you, and I hope to thank our panelists.
Yeah, thank you so much, Richard, and this was really wonderful and thought-provoking. I think that what's important sort of to end on is that we don't have definitive answers to any of these questions. And in fact, I think I would be disappointed by our own arrogance if we tried to answer some of these very uncertain, very complex questions that are on the horizon. What I'm hoping we do instead is start to build a community which pushes the conversations and also experiments on the ground in innovative and thought-provoking ways. So rather than people who are jumping on buzzword bandwagons, that we are able to think and act in more critical, thoughtful, concerned ways into the future. And I hope that everyone will take a look at the report, which we should be circulating to everyone who is on the call today and will be on the Pinsent Mason website. We hope that it's a provocative piece and it has been translated as well into Mandarin. So please do take a look and circulate and come back to us with feedback or questions. I would like to really extend a thank you to the panelists who did a lot of preparation for this event today, as well as the Pinsent Masons and the African Center for Cities teams that have sat behind it. Thank you to Alma, thank you to Dale, and also to Claire and George, who conceptualized a lot of this program with me in early phases over 2 years ago. It has been invaluable to learn from yourselves and your clients. So with that, I would like to thank everyone who's come on. We have a record of all the questions, and I hope that they lead us to be able to think even more over the next period about how we will be recovering from and engaging with the problems and opportunities that COVID has presented to Africa and African cities. So thank you also to Richard for facilitating this session.
It's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you to all of you who participated in it and for the excellent questions and for the excellent discussion. And with that, we shall leave you to enjoy the rest of your day. We hope to see you again before too long for another discussion on another interesting topic. But until then, please enjoy your day and stay well and stay safe. Thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.